Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly King, comforter, the Spirit of truth, who are ever present, fills all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanses of all stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So, after having to take 2 weeks off because I was traveling, now the devil's going to put his tail into all of the works. So I'm running late, and now the TV isn't working, but we'll make do. We'll be okay. So we've been going through the church calendar, and we've done sort of an introduction to it. We've talked about the various cycles that are working in our liturgical calendar. And now I want to talk a little bit about, or just give sort of an overview of what does a year in the church kind of look like, right? And what are some of the liturgical highlights and things to watch for as we go through a particular year? For some folks, this won't be that much news because you've lived it for so many times, but I think for others, it might be more new. And overall, it's helpful sometimes to just step back a little bit and see it. So we talked about the fact that September 1st is the beginning of the church year, the church new year. We talked about the reasons for that and how that came to be. So when we look at September, the two big feasts that really stand out, other than, of course, the church new year of September 1st, is the birth of the Mother of God on September 8th and the Feast of the Exaltation, the universal exaltation of the precious and life-giving cross on September 14th. One thing to note, what is the very first great feast of the church year? The birth of the Mother of God. What is the last great feast of the church year? The Dormition of the Mother of God. So the church year is following essentially the life of Christ and of his mother, right? It starts with her birth. It will then lead to his life, right? And then eventually into his death and resurrection, his ascension, the giving of the Holy Spirit, and then her death and translation to heaven, right? So there's actually a very logical and chronological, in some sense, way that we participate in the life of Christ through the church year. Does that make sense? By the way, September 14th, because everything is cyclical, right? September 14th, the Feast of the Cross, comes 40 days after what feast? The Transfiguration of Christ on August 6th. When did the Transfiguration of Christ take place in his life? 40 days before his death on the cross. Okay? There's a very intentional tying of those two feasts. So the first feasts of the year are tied to the last feasts of the liturgical year. And we'll talk when we get to it, when we get to Transfiguration in August, we'll talk about why it's celebrated in August. Some of you may recall we touched on it in a class many times. August 6th, Transfiguration.
No, I want
But
to say the mention of like the Virgin Mary.
Yes, August 15th, right,
Okay.
right. So the first feast is her birth, and the last feast is her death,
Yeah.
right? All right, so September 8th, right, the hymn we sing, Your birth, O Theotokos, brought joy to the whole world. For from you dawned the Son of Righteousness, Christ our God. Freeing us from the curse, he gave us his blessings, abolishing death. He granted us eternal life. It's important to note the only saints whose conception and birth we celebrate are the Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist. No other saints do we commemorate their earthly conception or birth, right? Generally, we celebrate their birth into heaven, which is the day of their death, right? Not the day of their earthly birth. Panagia and St. John the Forerunner are the exceptions to that. And the very next day after September 8th, we celebrate the feasts of St. Joachim and Anna, because they were the two people who were the most important in her birth, right? And so we celebrate her parents the very next day, the Synaxes. Um, the feast, as far as we can tell, was first celebrated in Jerusalem in around the 6th century. That's when they first started commemorating this. And it eventually gets to the west by the late 7th century. So it's spreading first in the east from Jerusalem and then into the west. It's notable for a lot of these feasts that relate to the life of the Virgin Mary and of Christ. They start being celebrated for the most part in Jerusalem. And then their celebrations spread. And it's important to note that even in the 4th century, when we read the church historian Eusebius, he talks about the fact that there were Jewish Christians living in Palestine, in the Holy Land, who were relatives of Christ. Throughout much of the 1st and into the 2nd century, his relatives were still maintaining the memory, the family history of the Virgin Mary, of St. Joseph, and of Christ himself. And these feasts that we get come out of that. They're sometimes attributed, I think, inaccurately to what's called the Proto-Evangelion of St. James, right? St. Yaakov, which is this Gnostic text that comes out in the 2nd century. And it's the only written record we have today of some of these histories of the Virgin Mary's life that later find their way into the liturgical life, like Saints Joachim and Anna being the names of her parents, right? And more detail about Saint Zechariah and Elizabeth and John the Baptist and so on. All of these features. I don't think it's correct, and there's no evidence to suggest that these things make their way into our liturgical life because of the Proto-Evangelion of St. James. We're not basing these liturgical traditions on that Gnostic spurious text. Rather, that text comes out when? In the 2nd century in Jerusalem. When? Not long after his family was still maintaining the memory of how they lived and what their family history was, right? They're both based on the same source, which is the family history. Some of that family history makes its way into the liturgical life of the church. And these Gnostic heretics take some of that history and incorporate it into this text that they then publish and falsely attribute to St. James. Does this make sense? They're based in the same source. It's not that one is based on the other. Okay? We're not basing our liturgical life on this Gnostic, spurious text. Rather, it's basing itself on the lived knowledge and tradition that existed in Palestine in the same way that we base our liturgical life on that. Okay? This is something that folks like, such as some Protestants, will attack us with, and some Orthodox will unfortunately sort of accept that criticism and say, yeah, we're getting these from the Proto-Evangelion of St. James. No, we're not. That's a Gnostic book that has been rejected by the church over and over again as being an appropriate basis for any kind of church teaching, right? It's simply a written record from kind of the same time suggesting a common tradition, okay? Sorry to harp on that, but it needs to be reiterated because too many Orthodox sort of innocently will say, yeah, we get it. See, look at the Proto-Evangelion of St. James. It's not written by St. James and it's not ours. Okay. So fast forward then about a week and we get to September 14th, which is the feast of the universal exaltation of the precious and life-giving cross. Of course, we sing on that day the Apolotikon of the cross, right? Save, O Lord, your people and bless your inheritance. Grant victory. We say in English usually to the faithful. What is this in Greek? To the pious emperors over the barbarians, right? That's what we actually are singing, right? Grant victory to the pious emperors over the barbarians. And by the power of your cross, preserve your commonwealth. Now, we've changed it because we don't have pious emperors anymore. And some of the barbarians have found their way into the church, thank God. Um, right, right. The pious emperors, yeah, or yeah. So anyway, we now will usually say it as grant victory to the faithful or to the pious over that. We do this elsewhere in the liturgy, right? What does the deacon do in the hierarchical liturgy before the epistle? He turns around and what does he say? Kyrie soson Joseph servis, right? Oh Lord, save the pious people. Actually, in the ancient liturgy, it said, Lord, save the pious emperors. Yeah.
This one has always been interesting to me, though, because in the Greek it's retained, while
Right.
that is also changed.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of interesting that in English we changed that one.
Right. We play with it. Right. I know. And in Greek, you're right. They've changed it in some places and not others. Even the Femis, right? The Femi that we do for the bishop, right? In the liturgy, the deacon will proclaim many years, first to the patriarch and then to the metropolitan. Okay. Again, that's not a feature of the ancient liturgy. That used to be a proclamation for the emperor who is there. And then when there was no more any emperor, we started doing it for the bishop instead, right? There's a lot of other features like this. The bishop's throne in the church is not his. We've talked about this in the liturgy many times, right? In our liturgy study. Where's the bishop's throne? Behind the altar, the high place. What's the throne that's out there with the laity? That's the emperor's throne, right? And over time, what happens is there's no emperor anymore, but there's this nice, pretty chair out there and a throne, and so the bishop starts sitting in it. And now we treat it as the bishop's throne liturgically, but really, and I think, I mean, it's an unfortunate development, frankly, because I think iconographically, it's problematic. The bishop's throne in the high place is the more appropriate thing. I'm going to get off my rant on that because I'm not about to go convincing a bunch of bishops to give up their throne and change the church architecture, unfortunately.
But I saw a lot of the Byzantine churches, and they
Mhm.
had that high
Exactly.
chair like right there.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't like behind the altar, it was
Yep.
like all the way high up there, and then it was
Yeah.
the throne.
And then the
over.
altar. Yeah, no, that's right. And right, the ancient churches are built that way. Hagia Sophia is built that way. Actually, our seminary chapel is built that way. The monastery in Dunlap, their Catholicon is built that way. There is a synthronon behind the altar. And I mean, what's interesting is that we still retain this a little bit in usage in that the in some of the churches that have stasidia, the stalls basically, where there's a bishop's throne and then like an abbot's throne next to it in monasteries. On the other side is a nice throne as well. And they will often put civil leaders there. So if the prime minister or the president in Greece is at a liturgy, he goes and sits there, right? Here in the US, if there are Orthodox civil leaders, they'll sit there, or an archon will sit there, right? There's sort of this retained memory that really thrones outside are for civil leaders and not bishops. But anyway, we get confused on that, yeah.
In terms of certain prayers for the emperor being given prayers to the bishop, today it also makes
Right.
sense that anytime there was a bishop, we would do those prayers. Back in the days when there was an emperor, were those prayers only done when the emperor was present, or were they done everywhere?
I think it varies. I think Kyrie soson tous evsevus, Vasileon, or however it would work out. And similarly, the Femi, I think, was only done when he was present. Like here, Υπέρ Sevon Orthodoxon Christianon in the litanies is actually a petition for the emperor that we've changed to being for the pious and faithful people. that would have retained a petition for the emperor whether or not he was there. Does that make does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Sort of similar with our Episcopal practice now. I think it would have been similar, but that's only an educated guess. I'm not positive. Anyway, okay. So the Feast of the Cross, September 14th. And I apologize, the TV's not working, so we're doing what we can. The Feast of the Cross on September 14th actually commemorates 3 different historical events. Okay, the first is St. Helen's finding of the Holy Cross, right, in the 4th century. The second is the dedication of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built by St. Constantine, which was actually consecrated on September 13th, which we still retain in our Manon. And then the next day, after they consecrated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the next day they brought the cross out for veneration for the faithful on September 14th. Okay? And then third is the elevation of the true cross at Hagia Sophia in Constantinople in AD 629 by the Emperor Heraclius after it had fallen into the hands of the Persian emperor. The Persians had stolen the cross from the Holy Sepulchre, taken it to Persia, and it was eventually returned, and it was brought into Constantinople, and the emperor and the patriarch lifted it up for everyone to see, to be blessed with, and then to venerate. And then it was taken, parts of it were taken back to the Holy Sepulchre, and other parts of it were distributed as relics. Okay, so this is in 629 AD. All 3 of those events then have sort of merged into this Feast of the Holy Cross on September 14th. Okay. Liturgically, then at the end of Orthros, or at the end of liturgy, depending on how it's done, properly at the end of Orthros, there is a procession with the cross, followed by the service of, that fell apart. By the service of blessing with the cross, the elevation of the cross, where the priest will bless with the Holy Cross in all 4 directions, while the people are singing, Lord have mercy, usually 40 or 50 times, depending on how it develops. But the priest will lift up the cross and bless. You'll see, this is a picture from this September. I was there at Holy Cross for the feast. And actually what's happening is the Archdeacon of our Archdiocese is actually sprinkling rose water on the cross while the priest is elevating. And I have a basin underneath where I'm catching the rose water underneath, right? But he blesses in each of the 4 directions, usually while someone is sensing. So there were other deacons that were there sensing the cross while he's lifting and blessing, and we're pouring rose water on it while everyone else bows and sings, Lord have mercy, 50 or so times. It is a day of strict fasting. September 14th is always a day of strict fasting, like Good Friday, no matter what day of the year it falls. Okay. Sunday, it is a little lessened in that you can at least have meals, but it is a day of very strict fasting, just as if it were Good Friday. All right. And one feature, for example, that you find is instead of the Trisagion at the Divine Liturgy, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy on us, we sing instead a hymn, Before thy cross we fall down and worship, O Master. In your holy resurrection we praise and glorify. Okay? We'll sing that 3 times, and properly we would prostrate with each one of those, not just, the sign of the cross at the Trisagion, right? With this hymn, really, we should be prostrating with each repetition, bowing down before. We literally are doing what we say, right? Before your cross, we fall down and worship. We should be bowing down, right? Any other questions about, yeah? Yeah, of the elevation of the cross that day. It's a unique feast because it's the Feast of the Cross. And so it's like a repetition of Good Friday.
Even if
Right.
it falls on Sunday? Or
Even if it falls on a Sunday, it's lessened. You have 1 meal with wine and oil, and then the rest of the day is strict fasting.
If I'm not mistaken, this
Yeah.
year it was kind of like that.
This year was a Saturday, but it's a similar thing. On a Saturday or Sunday,
Right.
you have one meal with wine and oil, and the rest of the time strict fasting. Yeah. Because of Christ and because of the cross and the glory. I mean, in the end, right, what do we say in the hymn? Through the cross, joy has come into all the world, right? The cross is our joy. It's our cause of rejoicing. In fact, the hymns are all these, it's this plagal first hymn, Rejoice. We sing over and over again. But at the same time, the cross is also our lament because it's for our sins, right? And so we fast while we rejoice on the day of the cross. It's weird because it has all the features of a great feast, but it's a fast day, right? It's the paradox of the cross. Yeah. Mhm. So strict fast, properly speaking, is a rare thing, which means really we shouldn't be eating or drinking anything. Most of us are not in a position where we can afford to do that because of working. How our ancestors were able to plow the fields and all that other stuff without eating or drinking is another question, right? But, properly speaking, on a strict fast day, which is September 14th, obviously Good Friday, and really Holy Saturday until Anastasis. The day before Christmas and the day before Theophany. These are days that are identified very specifically as strict fast days, which incidentally coincide with days when we do royal hours, by the way. It's an interesting liturgical facet. On those days, the stricter tradition is that you don't eat or drink anything, really. Yeah. Hmm. I mean, yeah, through full 24 hours. It's not Ramadan. Yeah, no, we keep going.
24 hours.
And really, yeah, yeah. I mean, midnight to midnight, but hopefully you went to bed and didn't stay up so that you could go to In-N-Out, right? um, what's that? Yeah, I know. We've all. I say these things only because I've done them at some point, right? I'm guilty. Yeah. I'll never forget doing an all-night vigil with a clergyman who was very upset that we lasted a little too long and In-N-Out had closed before we finished. Anyway,
We're so spoiled.
we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Meaning the resurrection service that night, the Pascha. Yeah, yeah. In the stricter tradition, which you find in the Triodion, in the Typicon, we eat nothing on Good Friday. Then on Holy Saturday, we receive communion at the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy, after which the priest comes out and blesses artos without oil and just a little wine with some dried fruits and nuts. And people right after receiving communion, they break their fast by having some bread, some fruits and nuts, a small glass of wine, and some water, and then they continue to fast the rest of the way through to Pascha. A few of us actually are able to follow that, but that is what's in the written.
I had a question about Arthoklastia. If you do it on a Wednesday, liturgically, should you be using oil and wine, or is Arthoklastia like an exception?
Arthoklastia is an exception with the oil and the wine. Now, whether it should be made with eggs and butter,
Oh,
I'm not going to get between you and a yeah on that one. Yeah, anyway, right? There are differing takes on that. and
It
I'm
used to
not
just be like a loaf
weighing
of
in.
bread, like a normal.
Yeah, right. We've started turning it into a cake, and then and now it's taken on all, like, it's now a sweet bread, right? It's all these other things, and right. You go to the Russian church, they use prosphora for it.
Right.
I mean, it's wheat, water, salt, and yeast, and that's it. Doesn't matter when they're having the artos. So, well, we do that too sometimes. We don't do it in our parish very often because it gets messy and Father gets annoyed handing it out that way. But yeah, if you go to the monastery that's that way, we're I don't know, whatever we are. Anyway. No, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing it, but realistically, what you'll notice is that in those places where they do it, the priest isn't the one handing it out usually. It's on a tray, and you go pick it up with a napkin and you get it. In those parishes like our own, where the priest likes to be the one handing it out, they tend not to do the oil and the wine on it because then he just ends up a mess. Yeah,
One thing that the Seraphim are off
Mm-hmm.
vigil, I think they did for the Ecclesia.
Yes.
And the taste was simple, it wasn't any.
Right. Yeah, they made it a much more simple version. That is kind of the way it used to be. Well, because most people didn't have a whole lot of butter and eggs to spare. Sugar was expensive, you know. Yeah. And feed the whole village? Right? Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
You said something like Theophania is a big fast. What do you mean?
The day before.
Which one is Theophany? Epiphany?
Epiphany.
Epiphany. Okay.
January
I never-
5th, the day before, is a fast day.
Okay, yeah, because I never
Yeah.
heard the word Theophania.
Mm,
I know it was
mhm.
Epiphany.
Right. They're used interchangeably, and we'll get to it in a minute. I'll explain kind of why, especially in this country, it's more common to hear it called Theophany rather than Epiphany, is to distinguish between the Catholic feast of Epiphany, which is very prominent and celebrates something a little different.
Oh,
Theophania is actually the older term for it.
I see. I never heard that word before.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, what is Theophany?
Yep. So just some other prominent feasts in September that you can have on your radar. September 11th, Saint Euphrosinos, the cook, right? Everybody has them in their kitchen, right? Remember to pray to him. September 17th, Saint Sophia and her daughters, Faith, Hope, and Love. Quick aside, Hagia Sophia, and most of our churches called Saint Sophia are not dedicated to Saint Sophia and her three daughters. It's dedicated to Holy Wisdom, which is Christ, right? Well, historically, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, its feast day was mid-Pentecost, which we'll talk about later down the road. Nowadays, many of them celebrate on Pentecost or Holy Trinity, which is okay, but it's a little bit anachronistic. It's because we don't know what to do with mid-Pentecost anymore. September 23rd is the conception of St. John the Baptist. September 24th is St. Thecla, the proto-martyr, and St. Silouan the Athonite. And September 26th is the Apostle John the Theologian. So there's just some other dates of more prominent feasts that fall in September. Okay. Moving into October, there are no great feasts in the month of October. Okay. There are feasts, but none of the great feasts. October 1st, properly, is the protection of the Mother of God, Hagia Skepi. Now, in the nation of Greece, that has been moved to October 28th, which is a national holiday called Ochi Day, and it commemorates the Mother of God's protection of Greece during World War II. It's a very modern phenomenon, and it only exists in the Church of Greece. And properly speaking, even Constantinople only celebrates on October 1st. Now, this country is unique in that we're, yeah. Mm-hmm. No. Mm-hmm. 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 The Greek prime minister, the leader of Greece. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, go ahead and finish. Keep going. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. It was a big part of um, you know, Greece's defiance against the Axis powers in World War II. And the Mother of God protected Greece many, many times, and the Orthodox faithful in Greece many times throughout World War II. And so, out of love for her, they celebrate the Feast of her protection now on the 28th with Ohi Day. Yeah, exactly. Very good. Um, So in this country, you'll find parishes doing both. You'll find both practices in this country, because while we're properly under the Constantinople, which means that according to our Typicon, it's October 1st, um, most of the faithful, the Greek Orthodox faithful in this country, are not from Asia Minor and Constantinople. They're from the nation of Greece. And so there's um, a tendency to bring that in, right? Say, I don't think Cyprus has changed it either. I suspect it's still October 1st. Um, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think in Cyprus they've kept it on October 1st. So it's just the Church of Greece that has kept it on October 1st. Yeah. Or the 28th. Yeah. Hmm. Speak up just a little bit. Yeah. Hmm. Oh, yeah. That was Father Nico's homily. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to tell? You can tell it. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad. Good. You should tell Father Nico that. He would like to hear that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Well, very good. In any event, the point is that in this country, you'll find that feast of the protection of the Mother of God celebrated on both days. Other prominent feasts. October 1st is also the feast of Saint Romanos the Melodist. Um, and usually, right around there, you'll see celebrations of church singers and church music as a result of that. October 11th is the synaxis of the Optina elders in Russia. Um, October 12th is St. Simeon the New Theologian. October 18th, the Apostle and Evangelist St. Luke. October 20th, St. Erasmus of Kefalonia, our Metropolitan's patron. October 23rd is the Apostle James, brother of the Lord. October 26th, St. Demetrios. And October 31st, St. John Kochura of Chicago. So there's a lot of really cool saints, much beloved saints in the month of October, but no specific great feasts. Any other questions about October?
Just a comment
yeah.
to make. 26th,
Mm-hmm.
the whole Thessaloniki
Mm-hmm.
celebrates. And there's a period that we call La Dimitria.
Right, right. The Holy Week of St. Demetrius, basically. Yeah.
And now so many events
Mhm.
and they overlap. Now they start expanding it. Half of September. It's
Right, right, right.
taken into the Dimitria.
It's beautiful. I mean, what a beautiful expression that the city loves its patrons so much that it becomes such an expanded festival, right? And it is. I know, like every day they're bringing the relics out. There are services in the church every day for at least a week leading up to the feast of, in honor of him. It's really a remarkable thing. Um,
There's his icon there that
mhm.
for so many weeks after, when it's his feast, all the meat comes out, and so then
Mhm.
a lot of people they go
Yeah,
and for that exact get the meat,
yeah, yeah. And it's
a huge church too right there,
yeah,
Thessaloniki, but
yeah,
never seen it. Huge.
yeah. I was traveling with the Metropolitan this year for the Feast of St. Demetrius. He loves St. Demetrius and the whole feast festivities around it. So every time we were going anywhere, he was pulling up the stream of whatever services were going on in Thessaloniki at the time, and we would watch and listen as we were traveling wherever we were going. It's really remarkable to see. In the 3rd century. Oh, did you have an answer? Go ahead. Hmm. Right. Yeah, I think it's the latter part of the 3rd century. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Excellent. Maybe the beginning of the 4th. I'm not positive. In
Why did
any
they have to
event,
change his hymn? Because when the hymn was originally written, it said like he's celebrated in Thessaloniki, and they changed
Mhm.
it to universally.
Everywhere. Yeah. Exactly. So November then, when we get to November, there is one great feast, which is November 21st, the entry of the Mother of God into the temple, right? Today is the prelude of God's pleasure and the proclamation of man's salvation. The Virgin is clearly made manifest in the temple of God and foretells Christ to all. Let us also cry out to her with mighty voice, Hail, fulfillment, or rejoice, the fulfillment of the Creator's dispensation. Um, it's commemorating the Theotokos being dedicated to the temple as a 3-year-old girl in fulfillment of her parents' promise. The priest Zacharias, St. John the Baptist's father, leads her into the Holy of Holies, right? The place where only the high priest could enter and then but only once a year. He leads her directly in there and it becomes her prayer corner for the rest of her childhood, right? Where she's actually fed by angels. Notice she's not afraid when Archangel Gabriel appears to her at the Annunciation. She's not surprised that an angel is appearing to her, right? Why? She's met Gabriel before. The angels would bring her food in the temple. Um, this is actually, I mean, incidentally, this is part of what leads to Zacharias then being killed. It's a big problem for him. Um, uh, down the road, not right away, but eventually, it sort of all culminates later in life after the birth of Saint John the Baptist. He ends up being slain. Um, One of the main imageries, though, that we see in the liturgical hymns throughout is this depiction of the Mother of God as a temple. The temple enters the temple, right? And we see that Solomon's temple, or in this case, Herod's temple, is actually an image and a prefigurement and a type of the Virgin Mary. She's the true temple, right? But then I think the thing to remember when we begin to then read the prayers of the church is that she then becomes a type for each of us. We are no less a temple when we receive Holy Communion. Right? When um, when the Mother of God holds the newborn babe in the manger, right, in the cave, she was no more holding Christ than when Father and I receive communion Or if you were at the Divine Liturgy of St. James and received in your hands, you held Christ just the same way as the Virgin Mary did in Bethlehem. The temple was a foreshadowing of her, and she then becomes the first participant and the type for each and every Christian.
Christ lives in us.
Because he lives in us. And we receive him in the flesh. We receive his very flesh into ourselves, right? And become united to him. In fact, in a way, in some respects, even more than the Virgin Mary did initially, because we've been baptized into him and have put on Christ, which she had not yet had the opportunity to do.
Paul said,
That's right. Yeah.
Maybe because, sorry, because, so Virgin Mary, she wasn't baptized.
Not yet, because he hadn't died and risen again, right? She did eventually, right? She became a recipient of the sacraments in the same way as the apostles, so on. But, I mean, in a certain respect, she's still an Old Testament figure at that point. I mean, the fulfillment, the greatest of all. And you know, other than Christ, the greatest human to ever walk the earth. But like St. Paul says, right, in, is it Galatians or Hebrews, that they all looked forward to the mystery of Christ, so that none of them should be saved ahead of us, right? It's an incredible thing to consider, right? Similarly, St. John the Forerunner is the last Old Testament prophet. He dies before Christ's death and resurrection, right? Now, the Virgin Mary was not only the final Old Testament figure, she's also the first New Testament figure, right? We see in her an image in her death and translation to heaven in her dormition, participation in the bodily resurrection that we will all eventually receive, right? But she's bridging both, right? Incidentally, this feast of November 21st, many monastics consider it sort of the feast day and anniversary of monasticism and a renewal of their monastic commitment. In the same way she was dedicated in the temple, they too have given themselves over to the temple, to the church. And so they see this feast as a renewal of their monasticism. In the West, it was February 2nd, which is the entrance of the meeting of Christ in the temple, his presentation in the temple. They saw the same thing for their monasticism, a similar theme. Other prominent feasts in November, there's a lot of great saints that day, or that month. St. Cosmas and Damian, November 1st. November 8th is the synaxis of St. Michael and Gabriel and all the bodiless powers. November 9th, we have St. Nectarios of Pendopolis. November 13th, St. John Chrysostom. By the way, what day did St. John Chrysostom die? September 14th. Now, it doesn't really work to celebrate his feast day on the Feast of the Cross. The cross trumps that. So we celebrate him on the feast of the day when his relics were returned to Constantinople after he had died. Okay, so it's actually the return of his relics, and we've put his feast day there. November 14th is the Apostle Philip. Incidentally, as we'll talk in a moment, right, Nativity Fast starts the next day. In some places, it's called Philip's Fast because the day before is the Feast of St. Philip. Yeah.
I also know that Saint Gerasimos, we celebrate the translation of his relics. Is the reason why that happens because their death coincides with the
Sometimes it can also sometimes have to do just with the rhythms of when people are available to feast on that particular island or that particular area. It's sort of sometimes one of their feast days versus another takes on precedence, right? Saint Seraphim of Sarov, for example, his primary feast day is January 2nd, but there's a summer feast, which is the translation of his relics or the finding of his relics, something like that. That becomes more common because when you're in cold Russian winter, it's a lot easier to feast in the summer than it is January 2nd, right? That sort of thing. So the November 15th, St. Urias, Samonas, and Habib. Is that a big, huge feast day? No. Why do I bring them up? Because two of them have their relics in our altar. And it's incumbent on every one of us, I think, in this parish to develop a piety and a reverence for Saints Urias and Samonas, whose relics we have in our church. You'll notice I've started adding them in when I do the supplication in Orthros sometimes. God save your people and bless your inheritance. Grant victory to Orthodox faithful over their enemies, and so on and so forth. Where it says local saint is normally where you commemorate the saint that the church is dedicated to. Ours is the resurrection, so there isn't one. I've started adding Saint Urias and Samonas there.
Where were they from?
I don't know it very well. They were they might have been Persian martyrs. They might have been martyrs in Persia, but I'm not positive. Yeah. I think they were martyrs in Persia, but I'm sorry? Habib is the third. We have Urias and Samonas, yeah, the first two. Yeah. We also have, and we'll get to the Saint Anastasia, who we celebrate this Sunday. This Sunday we should be celebrating a big altar feast. November 16th is the Apostle and Evangelist St. Matthew. November 22nd, St. Iakovos of Evia, the new Salikis. November 25th, St. Catherine the All-Wise. November 30th is the Apostle Andrew and St. Sebastian of Jackson, our local California saint.
The 26th is Stylianos.
Yeah, or is it the 26th is St. Stylianos. There's, I mean, I know, yeah. Well, our Presbyteria's name day.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
yeah. Yeah, and St. Alipios the Stylite the same day. Any other questions about November? All right. Oh gosh, why did I do that to myself? So the next day then on November 15th, we have the Nativity fast that begins, right? This is a 40-day period of fasting and preparation for Christmas. It's less strict than some of the other fasts, and so generally speaking, up until December 12th, fish, wine, and oil are allowed on days other than Wednesday and Friday. Then usually after December 12th, the Feast of St. Spiridon, the fish ends until Christmas.
Greece, I had that with Nikos. We were talking about this because he told me we're not eating fish, but I wasn't aware of that. I thought all the time.
There's some variation to that, but generally speaking, in some places you'll find that they start that on the 17th rather than on the 12th. But either way, there is a period where you stop eating fish in preparation. Yeah.
Is there reasoning for that?
Yeah, just we're getting a little bit closer, so now we're going to double down and fast a little bit more.
I mean, is it?
I think it might partially be coincidental because at that point you're 13 days out, 12, right? Sort of 2 weeks. But I think it's also just that his is a bigger feast day. It's a universally loved saint, and so hey, stop with the whole Anyway, and so that's sort of a good place to say, okay, we're going to have fish for Saint Spiridon, and then we'll stop.
I just didn't know if it was.
I think it's sort of a combination of the two. It was sort of this makes sense, right? So it began to be observed in the 4th century by monastics in the well, and then it starts to spread. We have references in the Council of Saragossa in 380 and the Council of Hippo in Northern Africa in 393. And we know, but it spread unevenly within the church. And we see it finalized and solidified in the 12th century in 1166 in the Council of Constantinople there. So it seems to have started mostly in Northern Africa and then sort of spread from there to other parts of the church. But it took a while to really, become universal within the church and really get solidified. And even, I mean, you see that by the fact that, like, we fast 40 days before Pascha, and in the West, they fast 40 days before Pascha, right? Nativity fast for us is 40 days. In the West, it's shorter. They call it Advent. It's shorter. The fast isn't quite as severe. It's the practice of it is a little different. And that's just because it sort of was slow and spreading and didn't take on everywhere. Does that make some sense?
Can I ask,
Yeah.
when was the Saturday liturgy during that period?
That's an even later practice then. Because that's not a universal thing. So that he's asking the practice of celebrating liturgy every one of the 40 days. That's more, I think, out of piety, coming out of the monastic tradition. It eventually does spread such that you can find priests like Father Ninos in Vallejo has been doing it this year. But that's I think a later piety that develops. Mhm. Yeah, I'm gonna head up there in the morning. Tomorrow is the feast of Saint Boniface, one of the main enlighteners of Germany. So I'm going up to serve with Father Ninos. um,
Where's that?
but in Vallejo.
I
Yeah.
He was
Mm-hmm. Right now he's at Saint Constantine Home in Vallejo. So yeah, he's been doing 40 liturgies. God bless him. Mhm. Mhm. So one of the things that's of note is that during the Nativity fast, we actually have a number of feast days celebrating Old Testament prophets who prophesied specifically of the incarnation. So, for example, we have Obadiah on November 19th, Nahum on December 1st, Habakkuk on December 2nd, Zephaniah December 3rd, Haggai December 16th, Daniel and the Three Youths December 17th, right? So it's a period where we're celebrating a whole lot of the Old Testament prophets in preparation for Christmas. And the Katavasias for Christmas, these hymns from Orthros, we began singing on November 21st, on the feast of the entry of the Mother of God. We began starting to sing some of the Christmas hymns. And then on some of the feast days, Apostle Andrew, St. Nicholas, St. Savas the Sanctified, St. Spiridon, hymns of preparation, for festal hymns, they call them, right? Sort of before the feast hymns, start finding their way into the services, usually in the form of, in place of, remember we've talked how in series of hymns, the Stichera and the Apostica, the final hymn is in honor of the Virgin Mary, right? Both in Vespers and in Orthros. That final hymn, in place of the hymn to the Virgin Mary, Theotokion, you start to see four festal hymns for Christmas instead on some of the big feast days, the big saints during this period. Okay, does that make some sense? It's just sort of little hymns of Christmas is coming that start getting sprinkled into the services over the course of those weeks. All right. Other prominent feasts in December. December 2nd is St. Porphyrios. December 4th, Saints Barbara and John Damascene. December 5th, St. Savas is Sanctified. December 6th, St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker. December 9th, the conception of St. Anna. In other words, when St. Anna conceived the Paneia. The December 12th, Saint Spiridon. December 12th or 13th, depending on the tradition, is Saint Herman of Alaska. December 17th, Saint Dionysios of Zakynthos and the prophet Daniel and the three youths. December 20th is Saint John of Kronstadt and Saint Ignatius of Antioch. By the way, liturgy in Oakland Friday, if you want, for Saint John of Kronstadt at 9:30. December 22nd, Saint Anastasia, the deliverer from bonds. That's whose relic is also in our altar. She's being celebrated this Sunday. Saint Anastasia. Anastasia. Um, was she in Rome? I think she's in Rome. And she was known for helping to heal people. She had medicines that she would bring. And she's often considered the patroness of people dealing with addiction issues. For example, there's a 12-step group at the Antiochian Parish in Orinda, and they call themselves the Saint Anastasia Fellowship. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, Saint Anastasia is a phenomenal saint. You should look her up when you get a chance. She's a wonderful saint. And we're very, very blessed to have her relic in our altar. Oakland has her relic in their altar as well. There was a period where the Archdiocese was given a large relic of hers, and they were using her relic, then dividing it for all of the churches that were consecrated during a particular period of time in this country. On the 7th, yeah. Which is also the feast of St. Ambrose of Milan, another one of my favorites. Mm-hmm. He's on the 4th with St. Barbara. Yeah. Yeah. It's an awesome week. Yeah. Like you could just, how do you not do 40 liturgies during this period? Because it's just like this greatest, like it's just saint, just incredible saint after incredible saint this whole time. Did she really? Okay, fascinating. Oh, in Serbia? Okay, so further north. Fascinating. There you go. Awesome. So then December 27th is St. Stephen the Protomartyr. And then December 29th is the Holy Innocents. There's actually, I can't go into it all right now, but all the feasts between Christmas and January 1st, like every day is an important day and tied to the feast of Christmas. The Holy Innocents, the Holy Martyrs of Nicomedia, St. Anicia, St. Melania of Rome, and so on. But of course, December 25th, this is the Patriarch of Jerusalem serving at the cave of Bethlehem. By the 2nd century, we have records referencing Christians celebrating the commemoration of Christ's birth, but there was no uniformity yet on what day they celebrated that. By the early 4th century, the date was fixed on December 25th in the West, which was exactly 9 months after the already existing feast of the Annunciation on March 25th. It was not because of Sol Invictus. It is not a pagan holiday. In the East, the birth of Christ was actually being celebrated in conjunction with his baptism on January 6th, which is why it was called Theophania, the manifestation of God, because he's manifested quietly in a cave and then manifested to everyone at his baptism, right? But we know that Christmas is then instituted as a separate feast in Constantinople in 379. And in Antioch, it's established by St. John Chrysostom, or in the time of St. John Chrysostom, in 388, right? And he was one of the big proponents of it, even though he wasn't a bishop there. And we have his Christmas homilies, and homilies referring to this new feast day of the Nativity Christ in December when he's preaching to the people in Antioch. Likewise, when he gets to Constantinople and starts giving some of his homilies on Christmas, he refers to it as this new holiday. So we're able to pretty well trace kind of the time of when it gets there. He didn't himself. I mean, it was already done in Rome, and then it sort of comes to the East, and he helped advocate for its establishment in Antioch. It had already been established in Constantinople before that. He was a priest in Antioch and a preacher, and he helped push for Antioch to adopt it, but he wasn't the bishop there. When he gets to Constantinople, they had already adopted it, but he was sort of encouraging people to observe it and treat it as special. So, a little bit about the lead up. The 2 Sundays before Christmas are dedicated to the Old Testament figures, the Old Testament righteous. So this past Sunday, we celebrated the Sunday of the Holy Forefathers. And this upcoming Sunday, we'll read his genealogy, and it's called the Sunday of the Genealogy. Now, there's a little bit of a difference in practice here. In the Russian tradition, the 2 Sundays before Christmas, they celebrate all of anyone who has an Old Testament name who's not otherwise celebrated during the liturgical year, they celebrate that day, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but the Synaxarion, which is the listing of the Old Testament saints, on that date doesn't actually list really anybody other. It just says today is the Sunday of the Holy Forefathers. This upcoming Sunday, the Sunday of the Genealogy, if you actually look at the Synaxarion and in the hymns of the day, they reference all sorts of Old Testament righteous. So you get those who are not, so like my mother is Judith. Judith is not celebrated in any particular day, but she's listed in the Synaxarion for this upcoming Sunday and in one of the hymns of the canon of Orthros, even though she's not actually an ancestor of Christ, right? And you see other, Esther and Gideon and Barak and some of the more righteous judges and so on. You see them being listed in the Synaxarion for this upcoming Sunday. So typically in the Greek practice, that's when all the Old Testament named people will celebrate. Does that make some sense? But the point of this is to emphasize that he's really human, right? We're preparing. First of all, it's a commemoration and a reminder of everything that took place in the Old Testament to prepare for Christ's coming. But then also specifically an affirmation of he's a human with genealogy, right? Or as we say in the hymn, he who is begotten of the Father before all time without a mother is now born of a woman without a father in Bethlehem, right? So we're specifically emphasizing and commemorating the fact that he is fully human, in addition to being fully God, right? Does that make some sense? The 20th through the 24th of December, there are also special hymns that are added at Compline. At the service of Small Compline, there is a canon, some prayers of preparation for Christmas that are added there. Okay? You typically don't see those in the church. Antiochian parishes will do that each night. They call it the Paraclesis of Christmas. It's not a Paraclesis, but good on them for doing it. Yeah.
Is it during the Nativity Fest? The mid-hours as well?
I think it's only on the first. There's usually the first day, if it's an Alleluia day. There's some complex rules for the mid-hours that I'm not so familiar with. Nativity Fast and Apostles Fast is where you see them appointed. I don't know anybody who does them. I mean, sure, there's monasteries somewhere that do them, but I haven't seen it. I mean, I have a book with them, but I don't know anyone who actually does the service. Yeah. So we have the hours of 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th that we've talked about. There are also mid-hour services for in between them that are celebrated in some monasteries somewhere, but I haven't found them. And only on certain days of the Apostles' and Nativity fast. I'm not so familiar with the rules for that.
That's I just want to go back to Holy Father,
Mhm.
forefathers. And I'm annoyed for myself
Mm.
for not knowing. I just said, okay, there's somebody in the back there,
Mm.
all together.
Mhm.
Don't know their names, maybe. I don't know.
Mhm.
But is it forefathers before Christ?
Before Christ.
Uh,
It's specifically the Old Testament righteous. Yeah. It's the point of it is the preparation, because we have the Feast of All Saints. That's for everybody, right? This is specifically the Old Testament righteous who led up to the coming of Christ. Yeah. It's very much December and late November has an Old Testament theme, right? It's why I've sent to some of you, we love in our family doing the practice. I think it's a modern tradition of the Jesse tree, which is a collection of 40 readings from the Old Testament that we do, one each day during the Nativity fast. We start with Genesis 1, and it gives you sort of the greatest hits and an overview of the Old Testament in preparation for Christmas. And it ends up being just a phenomenal way to prepare. What's that? You learn a ton. I mean, and it brings, yeah, well, and it brings all of these hymns and celebrations then into focus. You start to realize what is it that we're celebrating, and everything that sort of led up to Christ, God's plan through the millennia, in preparing for Him.
every year is the same.
The same readings, yeah. I think it's an American thing. I mean, I don't know where exactly it came from or who came up with it, but it's, in our family, we've been doing it now probably, I don't know, 15 years, and it's so meaningful. The kids actually have taken it with them to college. They miss it when they're alone, and they'll actually do it there at college, reading the readings, because it means something to them.
We're gonna do it this Sunday also in our church.
No, it's something you do at your home each day during the Nativity fast. Yeah. Um, mhm.
That stories of Daniel book coincides with the feast day. My girls are blown
Maybe,
away.
I don't know.
They were like,
Yeah,
blown away.
yeah. But it's really meaningful to be able to read that on his feast day. Yeah, around it. Yeah. Okay, so December 24th is what we call the Paramonie, the preparation for Christmas. It is a day, again, like we said, of strict fasting. Um, the Royal Hours service that we've talked about in the past is served on that day, followed by the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy. Yeah.
Can I see correctly on our calendar that we meet on the 23rd?
Yes.
Is that
It would be a really good question to ask Father Nico.
It doesn't say anything about the hours.
He added
Spanish
it.
liturgy.
He forgot it and added it. So 8 a.m. on Monday the 23rd. Yeah, good. So then it leads to the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy of Christmas. Properly, that liturgy has 8 Old Testament readings. We tend to truncate it many times in parish practice, as well as 2 responsorial hymns relating to the Magi. They brought to you Magi who worshipped you with praise and so on. It's this beautiful hymn, kind of similar to what we do at the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy on Pascha, right? These responsorial hymns. In some places, there's also, especially in the Russian tradition, you'll see a vigil that night with great Compline in preparation, all right, with Artoclasia and so on. Then, of course, we have the feast of Christmas, the Nativity of our Lord. we have Orthros and Divine Liturgy that morning with St. John Chrysostom's liturgy. The Gospel reading, incidentally, is the reading of the Magi. If you want to hear the Gospel of Christ's birth, you come to the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy and Orthros. If you only show up to liturgy on Christmas morning, you're going to be surprised to find out that you never hear the Gospel of Christmas. Because by then, we've already gotten past that liturgically. You're too late. He's already born, the Magi are visiting. So don't only come to the Christmas liturgy, is the upshot of it, if you want to actually hear the proclamation of his birth. The following day, December 26th, is the Synaxis of the Theotokos, right? We have this practice of celebrating the important figure who isn't the main figure on the next day. So on December 26th, we celebrate the Virgin Mary, right? And actually, the hymns are all basically just the same hymns as Christmas. We just do it all over again, and focus our attention on her. Yeah. Yeah, I think in the Synaxarion you can find their names. What was it, Melchior and Balthazar? Yeah. You'll find those. I've only heard Magi. Maybe there's a reference, but I can't think of it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. So then the Sunday after Christmas is the feast of St. Joseph the Betrothed, St. James the brother of the Lord, and King David. And the point of this, again, is to re-emphasize his humanity, that he has a genealogy, he has a family, right? Some of this order gets mixed up when Christmas falls on a Monday or a Sunday. I won't go into all of that right now, but this is the basic order. And then December 31st is the leave-taking of Christmas. We have our parish in Novato, that is the Nativity of Christ Church. They celebrate on the leave-taking, December 31st. So you'll find us up there doing liturgy that day on New Year's Eve. There's no fasting from Christmas through January 4th. Okay. No matter what day of the week, no fasting during that period. And then, as we said, you get to January 5th. So I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to give just a little overview of what's coming up, right? So January 1st is both the circumcision of Christ and St. Basil the Great. And it exists as sort of its own liturgical unit, in the sense that Christmas, we leave on December 31st, and Theophany, the forefeast, is January 2nd. But January 1st is the circumcision of Christ and St. Basil. In popular piety, St. Basil has taken completely over January 1st, and understandably, he's an amazing saint. But the liturgical priority is actually the circumcision of Christ, right? Because it's not only the circumcision, but it's also the day on which he gets his name in the Jewish tradition, right? He's given the name, he who saves, right? Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, when Christmas, at least in the West, when it was first established, circumcision was also celebrated on that day. I might be mistaken.
Maybe initially, by pretty early on, it's separated out onto the first.
Okay.
And then they would celebrate January 2nd, the holy name of Jesus,
Okay.
right? Kind of yeah. It's 8 days, yeah. The holy name, yeah. What's interesting is that they've, I think, largely suppressed that, and they got rid of the Feast of the Circumcision altogether. They made January 1st the Solemnity of Mary, Mother of God, kind of our equivalent of Synaxis of the Theotokos.
Is that like a Vatican II thing? Or
Yeah,
something?
yeah.
Okay.
They suppressed the Feast of the Circumcision. And what's so important, though, is that when you read the hymns and the prayers of that day, it's the first time Christ sheds his blood for us. In order to fulfill the law, he sheds his blood for us. and voluntarily consents to that, right? It's actually this powerful foreshadowing, right? Anyway, there can also be a doxology for the civil new year that day. Vasilopita is this bread or cake that we bless in honor of Saint Basil on that day. It is unfortunately, and most especially in this country, but elsewhere in modern times, become this sort of like New Year thing that every organization, every group, everybody does a Vasilopita at some point. Like I'm seeing it extend into like February now in some places. It's ridiculous, it's absurd, and it's unfortunately breaking away. It's a severing of that from the liturgical commemoration. And it's no longer Vasilopita, it's just the Pita of the new year, right? Because it's not St. Basil anymore. Anyway. Yeah, we do it here. I mean, throughout the GOA, it's become common for it to be a fundraiser for Philoptochos, and so everybody bakes a Vasilopita, and they come do it on some other day. And then even worse, many priests will now drop away, and they don't even do the service of the Vasilopita with the actual petitions and prayers and the blessing. They just come out and they take out a knife and they start cutting it and giving it to people, and it's no longer Vasilopita. It's just a cake to celebrate the new year.
Does it have also the coin inside?
Well, yeah, they put a coin in it, but now it becomes a lucky thing, right?
I know.
Right? It's not a commemoration of St. Basil having charity on people in a way that they didn't have to acknowledge that they were accepting charity so they could maintain their dignity. Right? That's the point of that tradition. And now it becomes totally severed from that. We don't do the service, and we're doing it at the end of January or beginning of February to say Happy New Year.
You see,
Anyway.
they like you the
Right. I mean, it misses the whole point. I'm an old man on my lawn yelling, get off the lawn, you kids. But I mean, but unfortunately, we've ripped that tradition apart from St. Basil. Properly speaking, it should be celebrated on January 1st with the service of blessing, and then
That's it.
done. I don't know how much in Greece people are doing Vasilopita. Yeah, I think it kind of
It's the same thing.
keep doing it.
All the
Yeah.
organizations, they do it. And it's not about I said Basil.
Uh-huh.
It's like about finding the coin and giving presents. And it's like,
Right.
it's to the point where it's paganism.
Right. And remember, in Greece too, they don't have Santa Claus. It's St. Basil that brings presents, right? And so St. Basil has taken on sort of this mythology in the same way that for us, in this country, St. Nick now doesn't refer to St. Nicholas, Archbishop of Myra and Lycia. It's become fat, jolly guy, right? In Greece, it's St. Basil has done the same thing.
That's where
You know.
we're the fat jelly guy.
Yeah.
Why is Vasily?
Yep. January 1st. St. Basil brings the presents. Yeah.
Better day to do it.
It is. And what's interesting is actually in the West, right? January 6th, Epiphany, was the Feast of the Three Kings, or the Three Magi, and that's when you got presents, right? And it is that way in a lot of places. So my in-laws growing up in Portugal got presents January 6th, and it was that the Magi brought baby Jesus presents, and so now baby Jesus is bringing you presents, right?
Is the gift giving day getting moved to Christmas? Protestant thing because they got rid of all those other faiths? Or?
Yeah, and a commercial thing, and there's a long history about Christmas and Protestantism. There were parts of this country that actually banned Christmas until pretty late. There's this whole, in England, Christmas became, here we come, a wassailing. What's wassailing? It's going house to house, completely stone cold drunk, and asking rich people to give you more alcohol, right? Bring us some figgy pudding. Oh, bring us some figgy pudding. We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. Literally, mobs of working class people, drunk out of their minds, will go to the homes of all the rich people, bang on the door, and demand drinks and food, and we're not going until we get it. All right? Yeah, it's what Halloween can be. Right, exactly. But it got so raucous that in many parts of England and this country, they had to outlaw the celebration of Christmas completely. Puritans wanted nothing to do with Christmas because it had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with debauchery and getting drunk and stealing money, Robin Hood kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a religious holiday. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I will say this as an indictment of every single one of us, right? Myself first. In this country, even we Orthodox have allowed the overwhelming culture of nostalgia, of commercialism, of whatever it is, to affect our celebration and our liturgical commemoration of one of the most important great feasts in our entire liturgical year. What's the liturgical attendance on Christmas? I mean, Petros, you're there chanting every year, hardly anybody comes, right? And what do? We do violence to our liturgical schedule in parish after parish after parish, putting services on Christmas Eve rather than on Christmas morning, usually skipping then the Christmas Eve services, because the only chance of getting anybody to come is to put it the night up out before, because absolutely nobody wants to get out of their bunny slippers and come to liturgy on Christmas morning. Right. The basal liturgy. Yeah. Yeah.
I would say it's even worse in Greece. Sorry to interrupt.
Mhm.
Like nobody goes to church on
Yeah.
Christmas Day. Like,
So,
So I wanted to say
yeah,
one thing.
yeah.
Or forget. These feasts,
Mhm.
3 feasts, almost apart, a week apart. Christmas, St. Basil's,
Mm-hmm.
and then Theophany.
Mm-hmm.
In Greece, when I was growing up, and still they have, you go from home to home and you use the calendar.
oh,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You announce the feast is coming.
Yeah.
Right. Right. The carols have a liturgical element to them, and the carols that you sing on any given day are keyed to what day in the celebration of the feast are you in, and even refer in places to going to church to receive the Eucharist and things like this. I mean, the kalenda, the carols have this liturgical dimension to them. The culture was formed by the liturgical celebration, not the other way around. Now it's being abandoned in some places or lessened in favor of Western commercialism.
They do it, but they don't do it they do it to the kids to go get money.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's it. They don't even know half of the time
Right.
what they're saying.
right.
Unfortunately.
Anyway, I'm doing a lot of ranting right now, but my point is simply to say, I think one of the most important pieces of our repentance, right, is for us to examine how much of my own celebration and attachment to Christmas is caught up in nostalgia that comes from Christmas hymns and family practices that are not informed by the liturgical celebration of Christmas. Right? That's not to say that those family things are bad until they get in the way of the liturgical celebration of Christmas. Right? You want your candy canes and your hot cocoa and your whatever treats that you have on Christmas and your opening of the presents and your dinner together. It's all fine, it's all great. Until it starts to conflict with our liturgical celebration of the feast. And then when we start to demand of the church that it change its liturgical practices to accommodate my hot cocoa and bunny slippers, I've got a problem. I've got a real problem, and there's a lot of self-examination and repentance that needs to happen. I'm sorry. Well, first of all, I would say if we're not receiving the Eucharist on Christmas, we better have a really darn good reason when we stand in front of the judgment seat of Christ. In my house, growing up, even as a Catholic, no presents were opened in the house until we'd received communion. Because there is no gift that can come anything close to the body and blood of Christ. And we've tried to carry that on with our kids in raising them as well. No presents get opened in our house until everyone has received communion. Period. I'm sorry.
What is the proper way? I don't know.
Mhm.
So, like, Monday, like, Eve, the day before Christmas Eve.
Properly speaking, Christmas Eve would be royal hours in the morning, either followed immediately or later in the afternoon by the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy, and then Christmas morning, Orthros and Divine Liturgy. That's the liturgical calendar, and that's what's followed pretty much everywhere in the world except for some parishes of the Greek and Antiochian archdioceses in this country. Our parish has shifted everything, by like 24 hours.
Even when I was growing up, yes, Christmas Day, early, but the service was
Mhm.
very early.
Yeah.
I guess to accommodate, it was at the economion.
Right.
Allow people to come, go home, and then
And get
they
ready
have
and-
breakfast,
yeah.
open the presents. The service started at 5 in the morning.
Wow.
Where was that?
It was
Wow.
at night. By the time we got home,
Right.
barely see just
Wow.
the lights coming in
Wow.
from.
Not in Athens,
Wow.
right?
Beautiful. Well, yeah. I mean, I was a Catholic. We'd go to midnight mass. We had no problem with that, right? Yeah, it's awesome. Anyway, yeah.
It didn't even really start at midnight. 11, like receiving communion.
At midnight. Yeah.
I don't know family, but it seems like a relevant question. How do you think, if you have kids in school, like I remember when I was in school, you're surrounded by the energy of Christmas, but the Christmas, which is like, the
Mhm.
secular economic holiday where we buy a lot of things.
Right.
And it seems really hard to convince a child to focus on the religious aspect and surrounded by it. I mean,
Mhm.
everyone, the first thing you ask after you get for Christmas, stuff like that. So,
Right.
how does one go?
And
about
I
that?
think you do that by demonstrating it. And so, I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? My kids are not yet parents of their own families. We'll see how much of it actually stuck. But, you know, I think you don't get caught up in it in the family. We would tend to delay when we listen to Christmas music in the house. I mean, at earliest November 21st, but usually we waited until much later. We would often wait until December 20th, which is the forefeast of Christmas, to go get our Christmas tree and start listening to Christmas music in the house. That's a little late. We found nowadays like it's slim picking. You can't really find a tree anymore. But it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And then sometimes we'd keep it up till February 2nd, right? For 40 days after Christmas instead. But I would say more than anything else, observe the liturgical traditions of the church. Be at the services. And the kids know that, right? The kids know that in the week before Christmas, they're going to go to confession. We're fasting in the house, right? Maybe you're doing Jesse Tree. Just keeping the fast, going to confession sometime before Christmas, and then following the liturgical feasts, that alone is going to make it really clear to the kids what you're doing, right? So if you're not eating Christmas cookies in the house 3 weeks prior to Christmas, in fact, you're not cooking the Christmas cookies until right before because mom and dad aren't eating them until Christmas Day, right? Well, now all of a sudden you're teaching them something about what this period is and is not, right? I don't think that it needs to be huge. It's basically just do what the church has laid out, and I think the message comes across. Yeah. Does that? Yeah.
What about even like,
Mm-hmm.
would it be better for us to do that after?
Ideally, I mean, my view on it is you don't do Pascha parties during the 4th week of Lent, right? So Yeah. What are the 12 days of Christmas? The 12 days of Christmas are the 12 days when we don't fast, we feast, and we celebrate the feast.
That ends at the office.
And it ends at Theophany. Yeah. I mean, there's one day of fasting, January 5th, in there. But otherwise, there's no fasting during that time. We should be celebrating, and that's when we should be ideally doing all these things. Now, the problem you run into is that people are traveling and people are doing all these things, but we've again, we're sort of, and I totally get it, but we're sort of allowing work vacation, school vacation, which now turns into ski trips or visits to travel all over the place, to impact our ability to actually celebrate what is a fundamentally liturgical feast, right? Put Christ in, right? Jesus is the reason for the season. Put Christ back in Christmas. Well, how about put Christ back in yourself by coming to liturgy? Anyway.
I just wanted to say, my 4-year-old grandson, he goes to me, hey, yeah, are you going to decorate? I said, no. He goes to me, yeah, if you don't decorate, you're going to miss Christmas.
Mhm. Right, right.
I thought, oh my God.
But that's, I mean, that is where, and look, I'm sympathetic. My kids are laughing at me. The group text when we went and got a Christmas tree the first week of December, and because I knew that I had a bunch of travel going down, my daughter texted the group, "Who broke Dad?" Right? Because like that's the earliest we've ever gotten a tree. So I get it though. I'm sympathetic to all of these things, and I recognize that this is the culture that we live in. But I think the little bits of resistance that we can do simply by living the life of the church go a really, really long way, both for ourselves, but especially for our children. I really do. All right. Really, really quickly, and I won't go too far into it, but looking, because we're not going to meet again until after Theophany. The structure of the services for Theophany are basically identical to the structure of the services for Christmas. So January 2nd through January 5th, there are canons at Compline in preparation. January 5th is a day of strict fast. We have the royal hours, followed by the Vesperal St. Basil liturgy. And then the next day, what's that?
There's the fifth that we
On the
fast.
5th, yeah.
Right.
And then on the 6th, we have Orthros and liturgy. Now, both days there's a blessing of waters, right? We'll talk another time about what the blessing of waters is and so on. The real question that comes up, though, is why 2 blessings, right? Why bless on the 5th and on the 6th, the water? First of all, there's a prayer on the 6th that only gets said on the 6th in praise of the feast, right? But more importantly, it seems that what's going on is this comes out of Jerusalem. On the 5th, they blessed water in the church. And on the 6th, they went to the Jordan River and did the blessing at the Jordan River. And that has come down to us still that in many places what they'll do is bless water in the church on the 5th. But then on the 6th, you go to a body of water and do a blessing of waters there, right? So in Russia, that takes the form of cutting across in the ice, right, and jumping into the ice. Whereas in Constantinople, or in this case, Tarpon Springs, Florida, as cross diving and everybody jumping into the water that you wouldn't do in Russia. Right. We had a lot of fun this past year. We were in Hawaii with the Metropolitan for Theophany. And so on January 6th, after the liturgy, we literally went down to Waikiki Beach, fully vested, 2 bishops, a priest, 2 deacons, and went down and did the blessing, the great blessing of waters right there on Waikiki Beach. Everybody's vacationing and, they're in their bathing suits looking at us like we're nuts. And it didn't matter. Fully vested, we're out there doing it. His Eminence is tossing the cross. Everybody's running in, and it was a lot of fun. We did have swimmers from the parish there that were jumping in, and everybody is standing around looking, going, "What the world is happening here?"
Something that is so obvious in Greece. So,
Yeah, everybody does it, and so anyway, we did, and we got it from both directions because then Santa Cruz went and they did it from this side, so the blessing met in the middle, I think.
I want to say one thing.
Yeah.
Actually, there are 2 things. associated with Epiphany
Mhm.
and the baptism
Mhm.
of people. That when we baptize a child in Greece,
Mhm.
we call it in plural, the baptiskia.
Mm.
The often is a theophania, also is
Mm.
plural.
In plural. Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
don't know exactly
Fascinating.
why.
Interesting. I don't know. I mean, I wonder if originally with Theophania, because it was originally a combination of the feast of Christ's birth and his baptism, and see, and the adoration of the Magi is also an Epiphania because it was the revelation of him as God to Gentiles, right? And so these three feasts of his birth, of the visit of the Magi, and his baptism were collectively known as Theophany or Epiphany, right? Eventually, they get sort of separated out in different ways in the East and the West. But I suspect, my pure guess is that it has to do with that. It has its origin in it being a combined feast. Um, anyway, I'm sorry, that was a lot. I know that I jammed a lot in there, but I wanted to get us up to and through sort of Christmas and Theophany before we took another break.
So Epiphany has nothing to do because the day after is John the Baptist.
Well, yeah, that's why John the Baptist is celebrated the next day. In the same
Okay,
way
so it
that
has to do.
the day after Christmas, we celebrate the Virgin Mary.
Right.
The day after Theophany, we celebrate St. John the Baptist.
Okay, so
Yeah,
it's all connected.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. All right.